Have you ever asked a question that shakes you to your very core? A question that lingers in your heart, refusing to leave. Why did this happen to me? Why do bad things happen to good people? Tonight, we're going to confront that question together, and we're going to face it not with simple answers or easy cliches, but with the truth found in the story of one man, Job. Job was a man who had everything: wealth, family, respect. He was righteous, a man who walked with God. And yet, in a moment, everything he cherished was stripped away. His children, his possessions, even his health, gone. Imagine that kind of suffering. Imagine the despair, the questions that would echo in your mind. And yet there's something remarkable about Job. In the middle of his pain, he didn't turn away from God. He wrestled with God, questioned God, and ultimately he discovered a truth far greater than his understanding. You see, suffering is not just about what happens to us. It's about how we respond, about the God who is bigger than our pain, wiser than our questions, and present in our trials even when the world seems silent. Tonight, I want us to journey together through Job's story, not just to understand why he suffered, but to uncover God's purpose in trials, the power of faith, and the hope that emerges when we trust a God who never leaves us even in the darkest valley. So I ask you, stay with me, listen closely, open your heart. What you are about to hear tonight may not only change the way you see suffering, it may transform the way you see God Himself. When we begin to speak about suffering, we have to start with the simple, undeniable truth: life is filled with trials. Pain is a reality that no one escapes. There is no person who has walked this earth, no matter how righteous, no matter how careful, no matter how devoted, who has not faced moments of confusion, moments of heartbreak, moments that seem to shake the very foundation of their lives. And yet when those moments come, we are often unprepared. We are caught off guard. We are tempted to ask the same question Job asked: why me? We search for answers, for someone to blame, for some explanation that makes sense. And when the answer does not come, despair begins to creep in. Think for a moment about the story of Job. Job was a man who had every reason to expect a life of comfort and blessing. He was upright. He was faithful, honored God, and turned away from evil. By human standards, he had done everything right. And yet, in a single sweep, everything he had worked for, everything he loved, everything he counted as security was stripped away. His wealth was gone. His family was gone. His health was taken from him. And not only did Job suffer externally, he suffered internally. His mind was filled with questions. His heart was heavy with grief, and his soul wrestled with confusion and even despair. We look at Job and we ask ourselves, why did this happen to him? And that, my friends, is the very question we all wrestle with when life turns upside down. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do faithful servants of God endure pain that seems utterly unfair? These are questions we ask when tragedy strikes without warning, when illness invades the body, when relationships fail, when dreams are shattered. The answer is not always simple, and the answer is not always immediate, but there is a truth here that we cannot ignore. Suffering is a part of life, and it is often part of a divine purpose that stretches beyond our understanding. Suffering is not always a punishment. Sometimes we mistakenly assume that pain is God's way of saying we have done something wrong. That assumption, however, does not align with the reality of the world we live in. We see it in Job. He was blameless, he was upright, and yet he suffered. We see it in the life of Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, accused falsely, imprisoned unjustly, yet ultimately raised to a place of power and influence. We see it in the life of Jesus, who was innocent, who healed the sick, who performed miracles, and yet endured rejection, betrayal, and death on a cross. Suffering is not always punishment. It is often a test, a trial, a refining fire through which God works to shape character, build faith, and bring about purposes that we cannot yet see. And here is the first lesson we must grasp: the presence of suffering does not mean the absence of God. In fact, often in the very midst of our suffering that God is closest to us. When Job's life was falling apart, when his friends gave him advice that only deepened his pain, when he could not understand what was happening, God was still with him. God had not abandoned him. The story reminds us that trials are not evidence of God's absence. They can be evidence of His presence in ways that we may not immediately recognize. Suffering also serves to reveal the strength of our faith. There is a temptation when pain comes to turn inward, to withdraw, to become bitter, to lose trust. But trials test the condition of our hearts. They reveal what is truly held within us. Are we anchored in God, or are we anchored in comfort, success, and ease? Are we trusting Him when the sun is shining, or are we trusting Him when the storm rages? Job's story shows us that faith is not faith unless it is tested. And when faith is tested, is refined like gold in fire. It is shaped, strengthened, and made resilient. Another truth is that suffering teaches empathy. There is a certain depth of understanding that only comes when we ourselves have walked through pain. When our hearts have been broken, we are able to reach out to others with compassion that is authentic and profound. Job's experience, though intensely personal, became a testimony to others of the reality of God's sustaining power. Our trials, difficult as they are not just for us. They can prepare us to minister to others, to console, to encourage, to shine a light in the darkness that someone else is walking through. And finally, suffering teaches perspective. It reminds us that life is not guaranteed. It reminds us that comfort is temporary, that riches are fleeting, that relationships can be fragile. But it also reminds us that God's purpose is eternal. When we are caught in the middle of pain, it is easy to focus on what is lost, what has been taken from us, what is unfair. But God calls us to look beyond the immediate, see the larger picture. Trials remind us to hold loosely to this world and firmly to Him. They remind us that our hope is not in circumstances, but in the one who holds all circumstances in His hands. Job's story ultimately shows us that suffering, while painful, is purposeful. It is not random, even when it feels chaotic. It is not meaningless, even when it seems to make no sense. And it is not permanent, even when it seems overwhelming. Trials are part of life. They are also part of a journey, one that leads us deeper into faith, into understanding, into the character of God, and into the fullness of the life He desires to give us. So tonight, as we reflect on the reality of suffering, let us not shrink back. Let us not turn away from the questions that pain raises in our hearts. Let us not despair at the trials that come. Instead, let us stand with Job and with countless others throughout history who have endured, who have trusted, who have discovered that even in the valley of suffering, God is working, God is teaching, God is present, and God is faithful. Because the truth we must carry with us is this: trials are inevitable, but suffering is never without purpose. Pain is temporary, but God's presence is eternal. And even when life seems unjust, even when our hearts are breaking, even when we cannot understand the reasons, we can trust that God is with us, guiding us, shaping us, and using even our deepest sorrows for a greater good. That is the beginning of understanding why Job suffered. When we speak of trials, one of the most important truths we must grasp is this: God is sovereign. He is in control, even when life feels completely out of control. Even when everything around us is shaking, even when doors close and storms rage, God is not surprised. He is not confused. He is not scrambling to fix what has gone wrong. He is fully aware of every detail, fully capable of handling every circumstance, and fully present in every moment. Sovereignty is a word that carries weight because it reminds us that our lives are not random, that our pain is not meaningless, and that our struggles do not define the limits of what God can accomplish. Think about Job again. From our perspective, Job's suffering seems almost incomprehensible. How could a man so righteous endure such devastation? But God's sovereignty reminds us that there is a purpose beyond our understanding. There is a plan unfolding, even when the pieces look chaotic to our human eyes. God's purpose in trials is often multifaceted. First, trials refine our character. They expose the weaknesses, the doubts, the fears that we might not even recognize in ourselves during seasons of ease. When life is comfortable, when the sun is shining, it's easy to believe we are strong, that our faith is solid, that our trust in God is unshakable. But the fire of trials reveals the truth. It shows us where our faith is real and where it is superficial. Challenges us to rely not on our own understanding, our own resources, or our own strength, but on God Himself. Job, in the midst of his suffering, was stripped of everything he had counted on except his relationship with God. And in that stripping, God revealed the depth of Job's faith and the resilience of his spirit. Trials also serve to draw us closer to God. When the weight of life presses down, when despair threatens to overwhelm, we are often forced to seek Him in ways we never have before. A depth of intimacy that can only come through struggle, a closeness with God that is forged when we cry out to Him with nothing left to hold on to but His promises. Job's conversations with God, his questions, his lamentations, and even his moments of doubt were all part of a process that drew him into a deeper understanding of God's wisdom, power, and His care. Another element of God's purpose in trials is that they prepare us for future blessings. There are moments in life when the pain we endure is a necessary preparation for something greater to come. Joseph's life illustrates this beautifully. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused, and imprisoned, Joseph could not have imagined the path that lay ahead. And yet, through each trial, God was orchestrating a plan that would place Joseph in a position of influence to save nations from famine. Sometimes our suffering is not simply to test us, to position us for God's larger plan, to prepare us to fulfill a purpose that we could not yet see or understand. Sovereignty also teaches us to trust, even when we do not understand. One of the hardest lessons in life is to accept that God's perspective is infinitely greater than ours. Our vision is limited. We see only the present, the immediate, the surface of our circumstances. God sees the beginning, the middle, and the end. He sees what we cannot see. He understands connections, consequences, outcomes that are invisible to us. When Job wrestled with God, he demanded answers, he questioned fairness, he sought understanding. And yet, in the end, God's response, though not a simple explanation, revealed His power, His wisdom, and His perfect control over all creation. Trusting God does not mean that we will always understand the reasons behind our trials, but it does mean that we can rest in the assurance that He is sovereign, that His purposes are always good. There is also a purpose in trials that extends beyond our individual lives. Suffering can become a testimony, a witness to others of God's power and faithfulness. Job's story, written thousands of years ago, continues to inspire countless people even today. Our own trials, when met with faith and perseverance, can have an impact on those around us. The way we respond to pain, the way we cling to God when the world offers no comfort, speaks volumes. Tells people that there is hope, that there is strength beyond the human heart, that God's presence is real and His purposes are unfolding, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. And while the pain of trials is real, we must remember that it is never outside the bounds of God's control. Nothing surprises Him. Nothing is wasted. Even our tears, our heartbreak, our moments of doubt are seen and known by the One who holds the universe together. The psalmist reminds us that God numbers our days and cares even for the smallest details of our lives. If God is sovereign over all creation, surely He is sovereign over our suffering. If He is sovereign over our suffering, then no trial can separate us from His purpose, no circumstance can thwart His plan, and no pain can ultimately prevail over His goodness. Sovereignty also gives us a lens of hope. When we understand that God is in control, our trials take on a different meaning. They are not meaningless. They are not random. They are a part of a story that God is writing, a story in which He is the author and He is faithful. We may not see the ending. We may not understand the chapters as they unfold, but we can trust the author. And when we do, we find peace in the midst of uncertainty, courage in the midst of fear, faith that carries us through even the darkest valleys. So, as we reflect on God's sovereignty and His purpose in trials, let us remember that suffering is not outside of His control. It is not chaotic, even when it feels that way. It is not meaningless, even when it feels hopeless. God is at work, shaping, guiding, refining, and preparing us for the plans He has for our lives. He is present in our pain, and His purposes are always good. The challenge for us is to trust Him, to cling to Him, to walk through our trials with faith, knowing that He who began a work in us will carry it to completion. And in the story of Job, we see the ultimate proof that God's sovereignty and purpose are not theoretical. They are real, tangible, and active in the lives of those who choose to trust Him, even when the way is hard and the reasons are hidden. Because when we finally understand that God is in control, that nothing is outside His plan, and that every trial has a purpose, our hearts begin to rest, our fear begins to ease, our faith begins to grow. And we are no longer defined by our suffering, but by the One who holds us through it. That is why understanding God's sovereignty in the midst of trials is so crucial to understanding why Job suffered. Faith in the midst of suffering is one of the most difficult, yet most powerful lessons we can learn. It is easy to have faith when everything is going well, when life is smooth, when we are surrounded by comfort and certainty. But the true test of faith comes in the moments when everything we have counted on seems to crumble, when pain presses in from every side, when despair whispers in our ears, when our understanding cannot grasp the reasons behind our circumstances. It is in these moments, these valleys of uncertainty, that faith is not only tested but transformed. Consider Job again. Here was a man who had been upright, a man who had honored God with his life, a man whose wealth and family were abundant blessings. And yet, in the span of a few days, everything was taken from him. His children were gone. His possessions vanished. His health deteriorated. And if that were not enough, he was surrounded by friends who, though intending to help, offered empty words that deepened his pain. Imagine the questions that must have flooded Job's mind. How could this happen to someone who had lived faithfully? Where is God in all of this? Is there any justice in the world? And yet, Job did something remarkable. He chose faith, even without understanding. He did not turn away from God. He did not abandon his relationship with the one who had always been faithful. He wrestled with God. He asked questions. He expressed anger and sorrow, but he did not let his suffering sever his trust. This is the essence of faith in trials. It is trust when understanding is absent, belief when circumstances seem contradictory. It is hope when the future is uncertain. Faith does not require that we understand the reasons for our suffering. Many times, we want answers before we are willing to trust. We want clarity before we are willing to step forward. We want to see the entire picture before we commit our hearts. True faith is often the courage to move forward when we cannot see the full path, to rely on God's wisdom when human wisdom fails, to believe in His goodness even when life appears to be unfair. Job's life teaches us that faith is not passive, it is active. It is the choice to hold on, to persist, to cry out to God, to seek Him in prayer, and to continue trusting Him even when the reasons are hidden. Faith also changes the way we experience suffering. When we trust God in the middle of our trials, our perspective shifts. We begin to see that pain is not the final word, that suffering is not the ultimate measure of life, that trials can have meaning beyond the immediate. Faith allows us to see possibilities where despair would otherwise dominate, opens our eyes to the ways God may be working behind the scenes, preparing, teaching, and refining us. Faith transforms suffering from a weight that crushes us into a tool that shapes us, molds us, and draws us closer to the one who holds all things in His hands. Another profound aspect of faith in trials is perseverance. Job's story reminds us that faith is not a single moment of trust. It is a sustained journey of reliance on God, is waking up each day, even when hope seems distant, and choosing to place our hearts in the hands of the Creator. It is praying when words fail, meditating on His promises when fear rises, and holding on when everything within us wants to let go. Faith perseveres because it trusts in a God who is unchanging, purposes are eternal, and whose love is unwavering. Faith in the midst of suffering also prepares us for restoration. Job's journey did not end with despair, did not end with unanswered questions. It did not end with abandonment. His faith, tested and refined, led to renewal. God restored what had been lost, multiplied His blessings, revealed His glory in ways Job could never have imagined before the trial began. This is an essential truth for every one of us. When we maintain faith during suffering, we position ourselves to receive the fullness of God's blessings. Restoration may come in ways we do not anticipate, and it may come in timing that tests our patience. It will come for those who remain steadfast in trust. Faith also has a ripple effect. When we demonstrate unwavering trust in God during hardship, it impacts the people around us. Our endurance becomes a testimony, our courage becomes an example, and our hope becomes contagious. Friends, family, even strangers observe how we navigate trials, and through our faith, see the reality of God's sustaining power. Job's perseverance inspired generations, and our perseverance can inspire today. Faith does not exist in isolation. It has the power to influence and encourage others in ways that extend far beyond our own experiences. We must also remember that faith is not blind. Faith is not pretending that pain does not exist or that questions are irrelevant. Faith is honest. It acknowledges the suffering. It voices the confusion, wrestles with the why, but it ultimately submits to God's sovereignty. Job modeled this perfectly. He did not silence his anguish. He did not hide his questions. He expressed his doubts and his frustrations, yet he never walked away from God. That is faith, faith that persists even when understanding has not yet arrived. Faith that trusts God's wisdom over our limited perspective, and faith that holds firmly to the belief that God is good even when circumstances seem otherwise, in our own lives, can transform the very nature of our suffering. It allows us to endure trials with hope rather than despair. It allows us to remain anchored in the storm rather than tossed by every wave. It allows us to cling to God not as a last resort, but as the source of life, strength, and comfort. Faith makes suffering bearable not by removing the pain, but by placing it in the context of God's purpose. It gives us courage when we feel weak, clarity when we feel lost, peace when the world around us is in chaos. And so the challenge before each of us is clear. We cannot always understand why trials come, but we can choose to trust God anyway. We cannot always see the purpose in pain, but we can believe that God is at work. We cannot always predict the outcome, but we can remain faithful, knowing that He who has begun a work in us will carry it to completion. Like Job, we can wrestle with questions, cry out in anguish, and yet still say in the depths of our hearts, "Though I do not understand, I will trust you. Though the path is hidden, I will walk with you. Though the suffering is real, I will not let go of you." A faith in the midst of suffering is not easy. It is not instantaneous. It is forged in the fire of trials, shaped in the crucible of hardship, strengthened in the valley of uncertainty. But it is transformative. It changes the way we see our circumstances. It changes the way we experience God. And it changes the way we live our lives. Faith allows us to endure, to hope, and to trust even when the reasons are hidden, even when answers are delayed, even when life seems unfair. And that is why faith in the midst of suffering is so crucial to understanding the story of Job. Job's life shows us that trust in God does not depend on understanding. It depends on relationship. It depends on hope. It depends on belief in a God who is faithful, even when life is not. And when we embrace that kind of faith, we discover a peace that surpasses understanding, a courage that cannot be shaken, and a hope that will never be extinguished. Even as we face trials and endure suffering, there is a profound truth that must anchor our hearts. Suffering is not the end of the story. Pain may be intense, grief may be overwhelming, and loss may feel permanent, but God's plan moves beyond the moment. There is restoration, there is renewal, there is hope. Job's life illustrates this beautifully. After enduring unimaginable hardship, after wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, after facing despair and isolation, God restored him, not just to the place he had been, but to a place of greater blessing and deeper understanding. Restoration is more than the return of what was lost. It is a transformation, a renewal of perspective, a deepening of faith, and a strengthening of character. When we endure trials, God is not merely giving us a temporary reprieve, preparing us for something greater. Job's wealth was restored, but more than that, his understanding of God grew richer. His relationship with God deepened. Ability to trust in God's wisdom and sovereignty became unshakable. Restoration in God's hands is both tangible and spiritual, external and internal, immediate and eternal. One of the most remarkable aspects of God's restoration is that it often surpasses what we had before the trial. Job's blessings were doubled, his family renewed, his influence and insight expanded. God's restoration does not simply undo what pain has taken away. It takes the experience of suffering and uses it to cultivate something even greater. In the same way, our trials, when met with faith, perseverance, and trust, prepare us for blessings that we never could have anticipated. The very struggles we wish we could avoid often become the instruments through which God brings growth, strength, profound insight into our lives. Restoration also brings perspective. When we have walked through the fire of trials, we see life differently. We understand the fragility of comfort, temporary nature of possessions, and the fleeting security of human plans. But we also gain clarity about the eternal, about what truly matters, and about the God who never fails. Job emerged from his suffering with a renewed vision of God's power, justice, and mercy. He saw that even in the darkest moments, God had been present, guiding, shaping, and preparing him for a future that was beyond his imagining. Trials in this way are not wasted. They are the very soil in which our spiritual growth takes root and flourishes. God's restoration is also deeply personal. It meets the individual needs of the heart, soul, and life of each person. It may be emotional healing, physical renewal, restored relationships, financial provision, or a renewed sense of purpose. Restoration is not one size fits all. God meets us where we are in the depths of our pain. He restores exactly what we need to continue His work and fulfill His plan for our lives. Job's restoration was comprehensive because God understood every dimension of his life, his grief, his longing, his losses, and his potential. In the same way, God knows what each of us needs to restore our lives fully. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of enduring trials is the deeper reward of spiritual maturity. Restoration is not only about regaining what was lost, it is about the transformation that takes place within us. Trials refine our character. They cultivate perseverance, patience, humility, and wisdom. They teach us to rely not on our own understanding, but on God's infinite wisdom. Job's story shows us that the ultimate reward of enduring trials is not simply the return of comfort or possessions. It is the development of a resilient faith, a deeper intimacy with God, and an unwavering trust that shapes the way we live and witness to others. In addition, enduring trials and experiencing restoration equips us to minister to others. Our stories of perseverance, our experiences of faith in the midst of suffering, and our understanding of God's faithfulness become powerful testimonies. They encourage, uplift, and guide those who are walking through their own valleys. Job's endurance continues to inspire countless generations. Similarly, our faithfulness in the midst of trials can become a light to someone who is struggling, showing them that God is real, that He is present, and that He brings redemption even from the darkest circumstances. Restoration also reinforces hope. Trials may test us, suffering may challenge us, but restoration reminds us that God is always faithful. Hope is not wishful thinking. It is confidence in God's promises, rooted in His character and His faithfulness. Job could have given up hope, but he clung to the truth that God is just loving and sovereign. In the same way, we are called to hold on to hope even when the path is difficult, knowing that God is not done with us and that His plans are for our ultimate good. Restoration reminds us that God's timing is perfect, His ways are higher than our ways, and His love for us never fails. Moreover, the rewards of enduring trials extend beyond the temporal into the eternal. Suffering, when met with faith, becomes a conduit for eternal growth. The lessons learned, the character developed, the intimacy with God cultivated, all of these bear fruit that lasts far beyond the current life. Job's story is preserved for generations precisely because his faithfulness in trials and his ultimate restoration reveal God's glory and His plan for humanity. Our trials, endured with trust and hope, similarly become part of a larger story, one that transcends the moment and points to eternity. And as we reflect on God's restoration, we realize that it is also an invitation to trust Him more fully, to surrender control, to let go of resentment and bitterness, to embrace the lessons He wants to teach us. Restoration is not only a return to comfort, it is an opportunity to walk more closely with God, to understand His purposes more deeply, to live with a renewed sense of gratitude and awe. Job's restoration was a culmination of faith, perseverance, and trust. His blessings were multiplied. His soul was enriched in ways that wealth alone could never achieve. Finally, God's restoration reminds us that suffering is never the final chapter. Pain may linger for a season, trials may test us for a time, but God's faithfulness is eternal. The story does not end with loss, despair, or unanswered questions. The story continues with hope, renewal, the assurance that God is at work in every circumstance. Job's life illustrates that God brings justice, provides blessings, restores what is lost, deepens the heart and faith of those who trust Him. So tonight, as we reflect on the deeper rewards of enduring trials, let us remember that suffering is not wasted, is not purposeless, it is not permanent. God restores, renews, and blesses in ways that surpass our understanding. He brings peace where there was chaos, hope where there was despair, strength where there was weakness. And the ultimate reward of enduring trials is not only what we regain, but who we become in the process, people of faith, hope, unwavering trust in the one who holds all things in his hands. And that is the final truth we must carry with us. God's restoration is real, his rewards are profound, and the journey through trials, though painful, is never without purpose.